Welcome, everybody, to Chronicles of a Dallas County Democrat. I am your host, AZ Zion. In this podcast, we interview local activists and see how they got to where they are today. And in today's episode, we have Democratic activist, my precinct chair, Michele Saranovich. Michele, say hi.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
All right, Michele. So before we go deep into this episode, I want you to kind of share a little bit about yourself with the audience.
Sure. I moved to Dallas 5 years ago from Washington, D.C. So that's a big hint. I spent a lot of my early years in Washington, D.C., working on the Hill for a congressman from Washington State and a U.S. senator from Washington State, and then went into consulting as a result of a major bill that was written by the senator to help clean up nuclear waste and nuclear weapons waste, um, sort of environmental work with the Department of Energy. And as a result of doing that, got noticed by uh, the Al Gore team, which he had been on the same committee that the member I was on and House was on. So that helped. And then worked on the Clinton Gore campaign and then a little bit in the White House during the 92-93 era.
Love it, old school. It's crazy you mentioned you said someone from Washington State. My first, and this is just the millennial talking here. The first person I thought of was Jay Inslee. I know it wasn't Jay Inslee that you worked with
Right.
because this was a little before my
Yes.
era.
Yes.
But it seems like a lot of people from the Pacific Northwest probably their real issue, the real concern is the environment. Is that kind of accurate?
Yes. Well, and also part of the reason is just if you look at the background of who was in Washington State, the senator that I work for, Henry Jackson, he literally wrote all the environmental legislation, like the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He was the chair of both Armed Services Committee and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So he was big on energy development, including starting some of the clean energy like solar energy, wind energy, things like that. But he also, he was the last U.S. senator who was chair of two committees. So he was extremely powerful and he was very effective, um, in getting stuff done. So he was kind of the father of all that legislation. And because of his seniority, he was able to, get it done. And people forget that the Republicans were really big on environmental legislation. Richard Nixon,
Mm-hmm.
who was president, created the Environmental Protection Agency. It was headed up by Republicans in the early days who were also on board with, protecting the environment and doing things like that. And now we've, kind of totally shifted. So a lot of the people who, develop the policies around climate, global climate change, things like that, like uh, going back to like the Rio summit. Now I think it's Climate Protocol 30 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Cop or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. And so uh, we just had a lot of people who thought it was important to protect the environment, and I think it came out of historically a lot of things like people forget that rivers caught on fire back in the 60s. I mean, in like Ohio and places like
Yeah,
that because of
absolutely.
industrial pollution. People got cancer. I think it started being more aware because of a lot of the movie industry, brought out like the Karen Silkwood story from plutonium stuff, and then the Aaron Brockovich story about the people whose town was poisoned by water from a plant, things like that. There's just been so many movies that have focused on efforts to identify and figure out what's going on and talk about illnesses that people got and things like that. So basically it was very helpful.
Were you passionate or as passionate about the environment before you got that job?
That's an interesting question. Really good question. My father worked on building hydroelectric dams, which during the period of time that they were building them, it was considered green energy, water, no pollution, all that. And then by the time I was in the Clinton era, they wanted to rip out all the dams, get rid of them, salmon fishing, environmental impacts, not really bad stuff, but mostly around fishing and stuff like that, became really sort of popular and still are in the Pacific Northwest. And they actually have gone in and taken out some of the smaller dams, but those dams, represent a huge amount of hydroelectricity that's pretty cheap compared to other forms like we have here in Texas, where you use natural gas, you use lots of things that aren't as cheap, let's put it that way, or less expensive. But I think because of my father's work on doing things like that, um, it gave me a perspective going into it. And then basically, when you see people who are really passionate about things, like Al Gore has always been very passionate about the environment, it's hard not to get enthusiastic. And then I worked on some things that were extremely difficult to get done, and some of them never have gotten done, like the legislation that was passed by Senator Jackson was called the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. And it set out a timeline, a path, a way to pay for it by charging the electric utilities, not the consumers, for uh, developing, a way to dispose of high level nuclear waste from commercial nuclear power plants. And it was supposed to be all done and built by 1997. Now we're almost, 20 years later. Here we're going into 2026. And what happened was it became a political sort of nightmare, because we ultimately identified that the Yucca Mountain site, west of Las Vegas in Nevada, was a great place to build
Uh-huh.
it. It was safe, secure. It'd
Uh-huh.
be, really deep underground. There's no water there. All the kind of good things you want to have. But then Harry Reid was the Democratic leader of the Senate. And he stopped it, and then George Bush came in 2000, and he stopped it. And basically it just died. The thing never got built. So now, the roughly 120 commercial nuclear power plants in the United States just store this stuff on site inside, or they're in casts, like concrete casts that are very large, sitting outside of the power plant, which is, not really the best method because it's accessible. They have to really increase their security for terrorism, aspects, things like that. And it's not good stuff to be exposed to.
Absolutely. I remember the first time I heard about Yucca Mountain was actually the 2008 presidential campaign.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm like, they're storing what in this mountain?
yeah.
Nuclear
Well,
waste. So that was
it was a really interesting process. It was a very long environmental process, and we wrote documents that were 1,000 pages thick. We looked at Texas because they have salt mines in Texas. We looked at Louisiana because of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is also another kind of salt thing. In the meantime, we were building what was called the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which now has become an actual project, to store the really dangerous nuclear uh, waste, like thorium, plutonium, things like that, from the Navy nuclear reactors. And that actually got built in southern New Mexico, which was good, and I was on that team. But the whole concept around Nevada, which would have been really good, just it just became such a political hot potato. It was like this, it's like nobody wanted to claim responsibility for it, even though it ultimately would have been a good idea. So,
yeah, that's
so
amazing.
anyway,
So I have someone who actually worked on policy. That's crazy because I've been kind of dabbling in it, at least from a volunteer perspective lately.
sure.
So I think that's really cool. You mentioned your father working on hydroelectric
Hmm.
dams, if I got that phrasing correctly. Um, was he kind of the one of the primary sources of inspiration for you to get involved from a civics perspective?
Well, growing up in Oregon and Washington State, there's the Columbia River that runs right through, and that's where a lot of these hydroelectric dams are. So
Hmm.
we lived in some really little towns like Rufus, Oregon, Goldendale, Washington, as children, and you know how you go on school trips when you're in school and things like that. So one of the first school trips that I ever went on was to the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, not normally where you'd think kids would go when they're like, third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders. But because we lived really close to there, they sent us. And, we went out there, we saw all this stuff. It's this vast, desert, and there's like, I think 165 million gallon underground tanks. That store the weapons waste from the Manhattan Project from World War II, that created the two bombs that were dropped on Japan. And so seeing all that stuff, then I'd go home and I'd be like, well, what's all this? And my dad, from an engineering perspective, would say, well, that's left over from World War II and blah, blah, blah. And as a kid, you'd say, well, why? Why is it there? And a lot of times, parents really struggle with questions like that, but it gave me exposure to, an aspect of energy production from the dams to things like nuclear weapons and nuclear waste disposal, which most kids never, get exposed to. And then growing up, I grew up near Walla Walla, Washington, and it's considered sort of downwind or, within the Columbia Basin where the Hanford Nuclear Reservation is. And people in my parents' generation started dying from really weird cancers and a lot of stuff that was kind of, medical science didn't really know what was going on. And so, the Department of Energy created a lot of programs to track, identify, a lot of these, kind of bizarre is not really the right word, but cancers that weren't people weren't normally exposed to stuff to get those kinds of cancers or syndromes, and that's been an ongoing project for probably like 40 years. I think it was a combination of, having a parent who worked on stuff that was big, like these dams are enormous. And then when I was in college, I worked on in the engineering office for the third power plant of Grand Coulee Dam, which for people out there who may have been to Las Vegas, there's Hoover Dam, which is really big on the Colorado River. And then Grand Coulee Dam is the grand uh, dam of the Pacific Northwest on the Columbia River, two of the
Uh-huh.
most major rivers in the United States. So it exposed me to all kinds of stuff that I had never, never thought about. But it gave me an interest, and then I sort of got picked by the Department of Energy in I don't know if you call it like a not a mentorship program, but sort of like we need to train more people in science and technology. And so I got selected to be in this sort of pilot program at the University of Washington to learn about nuclear science and talk about it and be a policy expert. So that happened really shortly after I went to undergraduate school at Washington State University, and just kind of opened up everything. It just I had lots of I was in a unique role. I studied with some of the people who did work on the Manhattan Project. Got introduced to most people won't know this name, but Edward Teller, Dr. Edward Teller, who was considered, the creator of the hydrogen bomb, and was a colleague with Albert Einstein, that kind of stuff. So it was just kind of a really fascinating time, and people were very interested in different kinds of energy. Although I think through the whole period of my being involved with this, people, have always been concerned about nuclear energy, not because of uh, really how it works, but what we call the back end of the fuel cycle, which is the waste. because the waste really, is radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. So trying to deal with that from a policy perspective was always challenging. You know, uh, at the Department of Energy, every single member of Congress, the House or the Senate, who wanted to grill us would, haul us up and testify on the Hill. We back in the olden days, you'd put volumes of testimony that would be this thick. The Secretary of Energy, the Assistant Secretary, blah blah blah, and you'd go up there and somebody would rake you over the coals, so to speak, about what the department was doing, how is this safe, are you complying with the laws, on and on and on. And um, we used to joke that we spent more time on the Hill testifying and in federal court because all the states opposed what we were doing, so they would sue the Department of Energy in like the fourth district, the ninth district, districts where we were looking at developing nuclear technology. So we'd be at the federal courts, and because of the way the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was created, you didn't have to start at the bottom of the federal court system. Um, you basically went right to the appellate level and then the Supreme Court. So it made it much more faster. Sort of like the Epstein files issue right now. What's in those files? I had to say that, you just have to get it in the
Absolutely.
conversation. Every social media
100%.
post, about something else at the bottom, somebody will say, "What about the Epstein files?" So, today being the day that it was all sent off to President Trump for his signature, we'll see what happens.
Oh my God. It's been a whirlwind of news the last week or so. So much to unpack there. I gotta be honest with you. First of all, I think you as a young person, you as a child, kind of seeing firsthand the impact of harmful environmental effects. That's not just I talked about this with another guest as well. Sometimes I feel like climate change, environmentalism, what have you, is just too broad and too vague a topic for a lot of
Mhm.
people. It's like, well, I mean, it's not affecting me. I'm worried about how I'm going to pay rent next month.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
talk to me about that. But when you see the actual effects, the on the ground effects of environmentalism or climate
Mhm,
change, you mentioned, people who have had health, had, bad health, suffered from bad health outcomes from climate change. I think that might kind of spur a young activist in the making, if you will, kind of like yourself. Would you agree with that?
I do, and what happens, which I think is really helpful, if you take something like penguins in the Antarctic or polar bears in the Arctic, so we're talking, the top of the world, the bottom of the world, and they're very popular. And when people see what has happened, or you see, a giant polar bear that's starving and can't feed itself because there's no seals, or there's just nothing going on, or even like the orca whales, the killer whales, which are big in the Pacific Northwest, also like Spain, things like that. And these animals are starting to behave, in ways that we're not used to them behaving, like orcas are going after boats and stuff now. And I think because those are popular animals and we see the change, we can relate to it in ways that, like you're saying, climate change is kind of esoteric. It takes a really long time and you really can't see the effects. We actually had a computer that was about the size of a desk that we would take on the road at the Department of Energy, and it had all these dials. So you could crank up pollution or crank down pollution, burn more coal power, do more this, more solar power, everything. And what it would do was it would, graphically express how the world was going to be based on all the things that you did to it. And it would show you like when petroleum would run out. Yeah. Which, when you can see it graphed on a computer, then it's kind of like, wait a minute, we're not going to have any petroleum after this date. That got a lot of attention, and we used to do these major road shows. We go to state fairs, shopping centers, things like that. It was called Energy for America, going way back. And believe it or not, we had electric cars then, which is hard to believe, but they were like muscle cars. You get like a Dodge Charger, and the whole front and the back end would be full of batteries, because back then the batteries were like lead acid batteries. They were gigantic, they weighed a ton. The car could barely move, but you might be able to drive it like a mile to show that you could have a solar, a electric car. But I'm kind of straying off the topic there. But basically, you have to find identifiable things that will make the public pay more attention. Um, acid rain was a big factor from coal-fired power plants, I would say like 70s, early 80s, that made them radically change how power plants were. And instead of just sending that coal ash off into the environment, they started putting scrubbers, which is exactly what it is. It scrubbed the pollutant out of the air. So, you wouldn't create acid rain that, would decimate the forest. It'd take the paint off your car, stuff like that, if you lived really close by. So there's a lot of ways that, people can find out about these things. I think that, the biggest harm that's been done is the people who are uh, client, or not client, climate science deniers. That's a hard word to say. But basically, people who don't think it exists, don't want to believe in it, don't want to take any actions to help. And like Mr. Trump's a big advocate of coal, which really is a dying source of energy, particularly in the United States. From the front end of mining it to the back end, it's not a really good energy source, but we rely on it in this country heavily. So, his taking away a lot of programs that were funded to help. Green energy and things. I'm talking, billions of dollars of funding he's slashed, isn't really helping. And, the other part of all of his cutting programs is, if you stop a program that's maybe like a 5-year or 10-year program and you're already 5 years into it, you've basically just wasted 5 years of science and technology. So why not just continue it to get the results and the investment that you've already put in it? As a policy person, that's where it rubs me the wrong way. I mean, if you want to have your policies, to be for coal energy, nuclear energy, whatever, the new hybrid hydrogen energy, new kinds of plants that they're building that haven't been built yet. But if you want to, do that, good. We'll do the policy, then fund, the research on it, get it out there. But to stop stuff, particularly like in the cancer research area, what's going on at the Cancer Research Institute, the National Institute of Health, those things, which oftentimes tie in with the environment, that's such a waste of what we've already spent, that's, to me, the really sad part.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, a young activist in the making, whose father worked in, the energy field, and who saw firsthand the harmful effects of climate change, goes on to college. And I can't remember how you worded it exactly, but it sounded like you were a woman in a STEM field. Is that correct?
That's very correct, yes. We didn't.
How was it back then as a woman in STEM?
Um, it was tough. It was really hard, the whole evolution of, women getting out of traditional fields like nursing, education, things like that. Um, it was tough. One of my friends from Chicago was a real, you know, uh, tough sort of nuclear engineer, and a lot of times they just didn't take people seriously, which was challenging. It was frustrating at times, but you just had to, know that you were either doing the right thing, or that, you could accomplish something or achieve something, to sort of have the energy to put up with some of the sexist, boring, um, sort of things that would go on. So, any woman in America didn't have to be STEM, or, lawyers, scientists, doctors. almost anything that traditionally changed in the last, I'd say 80 years. Um, it's been a challenge for women or people of color to, uh, take on new roles. But I think I've seen a huge amount of progress since I started working, and continue to see it. So it's good.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And you're right. It's not just STEM field, and it's not just women. It's pretty much if you're not a straight white man,
I
that's
wasn't going to
pretty
go
much not.
there, but you're right.
No, this is my podcast. You
Uh,
can say whatever the
well,
hell you want. To be honest with you.
it works both ways. I had advocates who were great, who, a friend of mine's grandfather who'd worked for like 50 years at Puget Sound Power and Light, which is what it used to be called, which is now Puget Power. He was like, well, I started out in the 1930s in the mailroom. I graduated with an engineering degree from the University of Washington, but they weren't hiring because it was the Depression. So I just took whatever job I could get. And he'd worked there like 45 years, and he was like senior vice president. And he was like, well, you want to come work for us? And I was like, sure. So, right off the bat, I was lucky because he had a bunch of granddaughters who I went to college with. And so, he knew me and he knew what field I worked in. And so it was great from that perspective. And then on the other side, you get, let's call them doofuses. That's a good word, who just, didn't want to accept really anybody other than people who looked, talked, and sounded like themselves. So, it's been a struggle for a lot of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what university, what college did you go to, and what was your major?
I went to Washington State University and did a combined degree in communications and environmental science, and sort of wanted, like, when the space, when NASA first, when I was a very young child, started, the Gemini program or whatever, all the Apollo programs, all those space launch things. Um, there were people on TV that, were the science reporters who, as a kid, we watched those. And I thought, well, that would be great, to go do something like that. And, Washington State University has what's called the Edward R. Murrow School of Communications, which he was a very famous CBS correspondent.
Okay.
And so I went there, and, graduated, and then went into this special program that I was previously talking about with the University of Washington, which was to do advanced training on engineering and science around all kinds of energy stuff, with kind of a focus on nuclear energy. So it was good.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So you get those 2 degrees, which myself could never obtain if even if I wanted to. What did you do right after college, right after you graduated?
I literally worked as a reporter. So, I didn't do that for very long because then, I got hired by the University of Washington to be in this special STEM program. And that took up a few years. And then about the next 10 to 15 years was when I did all the, nuclear policy programming and things. I worked at two electric utilities, again, Puget Sound Power and Light, now Puget Power. They were building a nuclear reactor in Washington State. And then I left there and went to what was known as the Washington Public Power Supply System, affectionately called Whoops, was not a good name. And so they were actually building 5 nuclear power plants in Washington State, and the budgets just got, beyond the scope of what was normal, and ultimately had to cancel. And then they defaulted. It was a public utility, so they sold municipal bonds to, get the financing, and they were AAA rated bonds, so of course people bought them. And then in 19, I think it was 80 or 81, when it collapsed, all these people lost all their money. And we're talking billions of dollars. And it ultimately helped trigger a recession in the United States economy in 1982, because all the savings and loan companies thought they were buying something that was really safe. Hey, it was AAA rated. This, utility company in Washington State was doing all this. Uh, you know, it had all the markings of being a great success and big revenue producer. And then when it collapsed, ultimately only one of the 5 nuclear power plants was built at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, going back to that. And so it was kind of a big disaster. And that's when I went to the Hill to work on oversight of the collapse of the Washington Public Power Supply System. So that's when I worked on the Energy and Commerce Committee as a staffer, and got to know Al Gore, um, John Dingell, who was the chair for like 50 years, Al Swift, who I worked for. Some Al Swift's not as famous as those other 2 guys, but certainly was, a big figure in the energy and commerce world. And he was from Washington State. So it kind of just, and then after in the 80s, spent 10 years with the Department of Energy working on policy around the nuclear weapons and nuclear waste disposal. So,
So, as a reporter on the ground reporting on these issues, could you kind of foretell what was going to happen?
um, it depends. For example, uh, when the Whoops budget debacle happened, it happened so quickly because the managing director, and this is just a broad generalization, but the managing director of the agency used a really bad terminology in a public board of directors meeting where he said, we're going to have to put a moratorium on building 3 of the nuclear power plants. He said we could continue based on the budget with funding that they had for 2 of the nuclear power plants, but there would be this moratorium. And back then, moratorium was not really a good word.
Hmm.
And what happened was the whole media blew up, from Wall Street everywhere. And then the whole scramble started because of basically bad PR about what to do about Whoops. And basically, the leadership of the Washington Public Power Supply System was told there's not going to be any more funding for any of these power plants. And basically, that's when it all collapsed. So we really didn't, you know, no one would have expected that it would have happened that quickly. There was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of oversight. There was an audit committee that was appointed by the utility was owned by Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, basically public utilities. There are about 106 of them. And the governors at the time appointed an audit board to go over the books. And what they found were massive overcharges. One was like a $750 million overcharge by an electric company that was, doing electrical work at these nuclear power plants. And ultimately, the head of that company went to jail for fraud. But at the time, they were just revealing a lot of corruption, a lot of, um, not good oversight, let's say it, of the spending on these power plants. And the budget went from, I could be wrong on this, but let's just, it went from like
Hmm.
about $8 billion to complete 5 nuclear power plants to $24 billion. And we're talking like 1980. So if you put that in today's dollars, it's probably something like saying 25 billion to 100 billion. It was a huge increase in funding that they would need. And Wall Street just, they're like, there's no way. So it basically impacted and was the last of the modern nuclear power plants that were ever built in the United States.
So this is interesting because I grew up in central Pennsylvania, not far from
Yeah.
TMI, 3 Mile Island, right? I was always, and this is kind of revelatory for me right now. I was always under the impression that TMI happens, and that was pretty much the reason why the United States was always skittish about nuclear power.
Hmm.
I didn't really hear the other coast, the other side of it, about this kind of sort of speculative, financial
Yeah.
weirdness going on.
Yeah.
Do you think that could have also contributed to the U.S. not really being all in on nuclear
Oh,
energy?
it was probably a bigger factor than 3 Mile Island. I
Really?
remember waking up very early the morning of 3 Mile Island, and I heard this report that said there's an incident at a power plant in Pennsylvania. And my brain kind of went like, uh-oh, because I knew every single power plant in the United States that was nuclear. And I picked up the phone and I called, a colleague and I said, is this like 3 Mile Island? And he's like, I think so. Well, almost immediately after that, President Carter called, and we had the same exact nuclear power plant that was at TMI. So we shipped with, Air Force gigantic cargo jets, the filters from our unfinished nuclear power plant to Pennsylvania to be used at 3 Mile Island to, continue environmental protection. But after that, um, it, I would say probably TMI was 30%, and the economics of building nuclear power plants were probably 70%. Because the early 80s were a really hard time. The interest rates were really high. Coming out of sort of the Nixon Watergate era into the Carter era, and then ultimately into the Reagan era. um, those early late 70s, early 80s days of the economy, a lot of people have just kind of forgotten about because it was so long ago. But in the
Hmm.
73 era, Nixon, we had the oil embargo, gas prices, gas lines. That's an energy thing. So, and solar and wind hadn't really taken off yet. So the traditional sort of sources of like nuclear, coal, hydro, and natural gas were pretty much it back then. And coal at the same time had its big problem with acid rain. So they were spending a fortune refitting all these coal power plants. We had one power plant called Coal Strip that was a twin generator, gigantic coal fired power plant in Montana in our repertoire of power plants as a part of Whoops. We also had a cogeneration plant, which some people may have heard of, but that's like where you can take hot water out of the earth and run it through pipes to generate heat and stuff. They do that a lot in Iceland. We were able to use the heat from the nuclear waste from the nuclear weapons program at Hanford to generate about 1,000 megawatts of electricity at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. It's still operating. President Kennedy, this is kind of Dallas related, right before he was assassinated,
Hmm.
he went to the Hanford nuclear site to christen the construction of this cogeneration plant. That was one of his last trips. But so it was a time and place where things were changing rapidly, and the economics were really impacting how things functioned. And it wasn't a great time to be spending billions, and I mean, big B billions of dollars on nuclear power plants that the safety concern had really escalated. Now, the good news about TMI
Yeah, yeah.
was you guys in
Hmm.
Pennsylvania had a tremendous governor in Dick Thornburg, who I personally knew,
Uh-huh.
and
Hmm.
good leadership with your senators and stuff like that. And Carter, being a nuclear engineer from the Naval Academy, did all the right things
He
so that
was.
TMI did not turn out to be a really horrible event.
Yeah, yeah. It's weird because I feel like the mid to late 70s was, Vietnam, Watergate. So not necessarily relating to what we're talking about now, but it's kind of like s- the ever increasing lack of trust in
Yeah.
government. So when something like this happens, then people are like, well, that's the government again. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but Reagan says, well, there's 9 words that people don't want to hear. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. So that was kind of like
Trust
the
me. Uh,
beginning
I know what
of
it feels like, having had to go to public hearings all over the United States and sit there and take questions from people and then try to say, oh, well, not the we're here from Washington, we're here to help, because you never say that, but basically, take the heat from audiences of hundreds of people that just hated your guts, because they were afraid of what you were doing and things like that. But I from the 60s forward into the 70s and the early 80s, things were pretty tumultuous. They kind of simmered down, I think, personally, in the 80s and 90s, maybe even the
Yeah.
2000s. Now we're kind of back in a new era of, it's
Hmm.
like, holy cow, what the hell happened today? Which is,
Hmm.
difficult.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right. So you reported on what was going on in the Pacific Northwest. Then you got into the Department of Energy. I assume they hired you because of, your on the ground kind of experience. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yeah, that's a
What was
no,
go
no,
ahead.
that well, uh, going to Washington and doing oversight for a congressional committee is pretty it gets you noticed, let's put it that way. So that
Yeah,
helped.
yeah.
And then because the senator, um, Henry M. Jackson was the author of the bill that created this program at the Department of Energy, that helped too.
What was your first assignment with the DOE? You remember?
Uh, yes. Well, we had to set up the whole office because it was a brand new program. So they were pulling people from solar power programs, wind energy programs, conservation programs, and they were putting all these people together in what was called the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management. And we, as sort of the policy technology experts, were brought in, as consultants to help set up this office, get it running. Um, it it uh, it had to, it had this very aggressive timeline from 1982 forward, from 83 to 97 to build this waste uh, repository. That's what they called it, which never happened. But so it was like creating something from scratch. There was no blueprint. There was no, uh, other than the legislative path forward of how to do stuff. So we were kind of just creating the processes based on the laws, the technology of how you could do these things. We probably had more nuclear engineers than probably any team in the US except for the nuclear Navy. And we had a lot of nuclear Navy people who, came over and worked on our program. And so it basically was just setting everything up from the beginning. And then we went into a period of probably 5 years, I would say, to do all the environmental work, write all the NEPA policy planning documents for all the sites that we were looking at, like Washington State had Hanford, Nevada had Yucca Mountain, Texas had the salt. Um, I forget what they're called, but they're like big caverns of salt underground, like in North Texas. And then Louisiana had the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We had a second program that was supposed to take place in the eastern granite rock, like New Hampshire, Connecticut, up that way. That ultimately was discarded later on, I think in 1987, when that program, they amended the original Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So that went away. So we didn't have to work on that anymore. But basically, you just went down this path of, congressional oversight, being sued in federal court. A lot of the cases went up to the Supreme Court. We were involved with how the technology was being created. So it was a massive program.
Now, you kind of mentioned this, or you have been mentioning this throughout, and I don't want to make it seem like a black and white issue because it's not. Um, but going to congressional oversight hearings, behind the door meetings, meeting even with constituents, maybe from time to time. I don't know how that role was, but where what was kind of the basic tenor of each of those meetings? Did you find allies? Did you find people that um maybe you didn't agree with, but like you could work with them, or and then did you find people that were just completely against what you were doing? Like what was kind of the basic vibe of all of that?
The basic vibe with a lot of public hearings was hostile, argumentative,
Mm.
very difficult. But, that was part of our job. That's what you did. You tried to like get feedback from them, public hearings. That's what a lot of them were, public hearings, where we sat there for the most part and just took comments. And we recorded all the comments. We used them for analysis. We used them for concerns, things like that. The congressional oversight committees, um, kind of went two ways. There were people who are advocates of the program. You get the nice questions and the not so nice questions, and it would go back and forth. And, a lot of the Democratic members, gosh, I'm forgetting the senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey. Ed Markey
Hmm.
hated the program. And he was in, I think he was on environmental health committees and things like that. So he would just, demand all these reports and records. And, we'd end up spending more time on doing the reports for Congress than doing the program. You'd say, wait a minute, I got this full-time job over here. I'm supposed to be working on the environmental impact statement for, a particular site. Then you get, torn over here and you're having to do all these reports. And we were doing a lot of this before, except for mainframe computers were, you know, the whole era of laptops came in kind of towards the end of the program, not the beginning of the program. So from a computer perspective, uh, there was a huge licensing computer program that we worked on with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission because they had to be licensed, that we invented, from scratch. And it was one of the first non-mainframe type programs. It was PC based. And so, we kind of were inventing a lot of things as we went along. Yes, we had supporters. Yes, we had, advocates, but um, it was pretty divided. And sometimes you just, uh, you'd be kind of exhausted from all the sort of heat you were taking from people. And sometimes, it's like today, because now we have so much social media and you see people posting all over and you're reading something and it's not true. And you're like, wait a minute. And you want to like either reach out or do something, but like it's a waste of time on social media to try to counteract somebody, because it's sort of their stuff's out there and they're not going to change their mind pretty much. And so, particularly at the public hearings, where we just sat there and had to listen, sometimes you'd want to like, well, excuse me, but let me, let me set you straight on that, or here's how the issue really is. But, you just couldn't do that.
Honestly, I thought you were gonna go another direction with that answer. I guess again, I'm like probably this is before my time, a little too young to remember this, but I thought back then it was less hostile. The behind the door meetings might be one thing, and then the in the front, like the public meetings, might be another. But I thought there might be a little bit of what's the word, like maybe whatever lack of hostility. Maybe people agree more. Maybe people have disagreements, but they want to come to a common, some sort of common ground. Whereas today, I feel like everybody already has their teams figured out, and they're just trying to yell at each other. But you're saying it was kind of like that back then.
It was, but we had respect. That's one thing we had because of who authored, Henry M. Jackson was highly respected. So we had a very ambitious timeline to do all this stuff. And it really happened later, a lot of the hostility when we picked Nevada. The rest of the states were like, phew, we're not going to have this. We don't have to sue the Department of Energy anymore. Because everybody was spending too much time in court. We used, instead of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, NWPA, we called it New Ways to Pay Attorneys. Because it just got so convoluted, and we'd have these massive numbers of attorneys and special counsels. And the Department of Energy has their attorneys, but if you go to trial, it's the Justice Department's attorneys. And then you have expert witnesses like me. You get the secretary, you get of energy, you get all these people that are all involved. And it's like I was saying earlier, you have your regular job to do, and then you have to go to court, and then you'd have to do all these other things or go, congressional testimony. I mean, that's a normal part of being in the federal, you know, Congress has that oversight. But we had a lot of it. Nowadays, you're kind
It's
of wondering, does Congress really oversee anything anymore?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds like the world's biggest startup. You guys just started
Yeah,
it. Back when when you took on this role, you're trying to figure things out. You're building the engine as you're kind of moving
yeah,
along, and then all the stakeholders are yelling at you
yeah,
anyway
yeah.
because they don't like something that's going
And
on.
the
So
irony is, had Congress not stopped us, this thing would have been built, operating, doing a good job, be environmental. Nevada is the best place for it. All of those things. It may not have gotten done in 1997 by that timeline, but at least it would have been done by now. And it would be much safer than what electric utilities are doing. The WIP plant in New Mexico, has been highly successful, no incidents, no anything going on. And it's got worse nuclear materials than what would go into the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada. So, yeah, it's kind of the irony of it is frustrating.
yeah, absolutely. All right. What were some of your biggest wins and challenges throughout your time at the DOE?
Oh boy. um, I think, we won almost all the court cases, so that was always good. And because we didn't have to go like multiple levels, we started right at the appellate level. And then if the appellate case, went in our favor, oftentimes the states wouldn't take it to the Supreme Court or the Supreme Court wouldn't review it. They would just agree with the appellate level courts. So a lot of the court cases were, rah rah moments of, yay, we can keep doing this, things like that. So um, I think ultimately the biggest frustration was that nothing got built, because 10 years is a long time to work on something. And,
Yeah.
other people continued after I left. I was like, all right, I'm finally out of here, my level of frustration's probably big enough now that I don't need to continue doing this. So uh, I think that's basically it. In a lot of ways, it was, because it was new and we, like you say, were kind of inventing it as we were going. That part was fascinating. And I think that's what sort of led me to continue and change into like high technology, internet, that aspect, which basically, was the last 25 years of my career, working on the
So
internet.
yes, because I know, Michelle, you invented the internet. Al Gore took credit for it, but you were the one that did it. So let's talk about the last 25 years. So after DOE, what did you do right afterwards?
Went into consulting and, uh, this was the early 90s. And so it was just the beginning of, the government getting computers and laptops and things like that. And so I worked a lot with Accenture Consulting, and we did government programs to like it. I worked at small startup companies. One was called the Marasco Newton Group, and we did some of the first, uh, basically building the internet for agencies like the Department of Commerce, the Environmental Protection Agency. And we got into that because, we were doing database work. We were working on uh, just very early stuff that you know about, like just putting stuff together in databases and stuff. And then uh, when it became obvious that, the government needed to use the internet too, we set standards on things like metadata, which nobody talks about anymore. Just, how would you do this? How should you do it? What's the security you should think? And in the early days, all the science guys like at EPA were so excited that they could get connections to the internet to exchange, you know, um, documents and things like that. So people were shoving computers under their desk and just hooking it up to the network. Well, you can't do that. And so we had to set up, like if you're going to share something from the government that needs to be peer reviewed, like a document or something, you have to go through all the proper channels. You just can't do it. And these scientists were like, "Yay, we've got the internet. We're just going to do stuff." And we were kind of like, "No, time out." And so a lot of those early years, probably up till like 2000, were setting, the security levels, how you could do stuff, when you couldn't do stuff, who was in charge of what, the creation of like chief information officers. Nobody had those before, chief knowledge officers, things like that. And so we did a lot of that work, and it was sort of fundamental to building the global internet, which of course then the private sector got into. And as we all know it, today nobody does anything unless they're using the internet. And so those years were like really gung-ho years. And I worked on some really interesting stuff like supply chain things for the aerospace industry and airlines, where within hours we could get a part. Say you were sitting on the runway at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and something happened and you needed a part, like maybe let's just say something simple like a windshield wiper for your jet. We could get you the windshield wiper like almost instantaneously to fix the jet so it could take off with, a boatload of people. And so that kind of supply chain stuff was in the early days of creation. And those companies, got bought and sold and acquired. Um, I work for a company that the name no longer exists, but people in the geospatial industry, there were two geospatial companies in the United States, and Navtech was based out of Chicago. And then the other was, God, I'm going to forget the name of it now, but it's based in California, Esri, ESRI, and then Navtech.
ESRI, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So those were the two basic, really literally only geospatial firms that existed back then. And so the Navtech team put a consortium together in the 2007 to 2009 era to do the first, content-based mapping for cell phones, for geospatial devices, for cars, everything. And I worked on that program. So that was like, okay, again, how do you do this stuff from scratch? What do you have to do? How do you geolocate every single location on the globe? It was incredibly fun. And, that technology has been around since then and everybody uses it. So there's a lot
It's
of things that are kind of really fun that, I was able to work on that made it really gratifying.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you were on the front lines of a lot of the bleeding edge stuff, whether it was the DOE or whether it's kind of like building out the internet. A lot of people don't realize that. I don't know if like you had come into this period, but the internet way back then was really just a way for people to transfer files one another,
Yeah.
right? Um, that's where the protocol originally started.
Well, and actually,
Before it kind of blossomed into this.
well, the Department of Energy, the Defense Department, literally were the creators. DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Projects Agency, I think.
Hmm.
And we were
Hmm.
involved in the early days. And I will tell you, there were some really funny stories because we connected all the defense labs in Nevada and various things with the Department of Energy. And it was all mainframe computers, green screens, all this kind of crazy stuff. And, one time I had to go to the secretary, who was a 4-star Navy admiral. He'd left the Navy, and then went over to be the head of Department of Energy. And I was saying, if you type on this screen, you can send an email. And he goes, "What the hell's an email?" And I was like, "Well, it's electronic mail, but we're going to, send." And you type this in, you put to from blah, blah, blah. And he looks at me, he goes, "Saranovich, if I want to call somebody at the Nevada test site, I'm going to pick up my phone and call them." I was like, "Well, yeah, but this is like, what happens if your telephone's down? Happens if you know, it's not working?" And he goes, "Well, they'll just come to Washington and tell me." It's like, I know, but what we're trying to explain here is like, you can do this instantaneously. And he goes, "Instantaneously?" And I was like, "Yeah, once you hit send, it's gone. It's going to be there." And he goes, "Well, how will I know?" It's like, well, it's kinda hard to explain that to you, but, basically you'll get a response or you won't get a response or something. But he was very skeptical, he was like, "I don't really know why I need to send an email to anybody."
I was actually gonna ask kind of about that skepticism. I worked in tech too, which is why me and you get
Yeah.
along, to be honest. Um, and I've been most of the projects that I was on was, selling to private industry, right? But then, there was some stuff where we had to have, you know, public government kind of protocol
Mhm.
to it. And I found that kind of challenging dealing with government agencies. Um, how was it? Was it like, would you call your dealings, with government agencies challenging, or like how difficult or how easy was it for
Oh
you?
my god. The difference between the private sector and the government sector is like, I mean, the government is tedious, it's difficult, the security levels, all that. When you shift and go over to the private sector, having, worked with the government, everything's like bam, 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 it just goes.
Hmm.
So, kind of once you leave that environment, you don't really ever want to go back. And they've been responsible for a lot of good stuff, like uh oh gosh, I can't even think of the name of it. NIST, the National Institute of Technology Agency, you know, science and technology. There's a lot of good stuff that comes out of the government, but it's really slow. And in the private sector, everything kind of tends to be much, much faster. So, having done both, there's a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So you did that for 25 years. I think, what did you do after that?
Retire,
That's
become a precinct chair in Dallas.
I was like, I'm pretty sure I know what the next step is. I just wasn't completely sure. So you move here to Dallas, and that's where I met you, right?
Yes.
So I think I knocked on your door one day. I think this was one day in 2022.
Yeah.
We were planning we were planning a Halloween party. Colin Elred was the main attendee
Yep.
there.
Mhm.
So I knocked on your door. I hadn't, seen your name before because I think you had just moved. So I was like, oh, cool. I think she's a Democrat based on the data. So I invited you there, and you've been active ever since. So thank you, Michelle. I appreciate you. How is your time? And of course, I was the precinct
Yeah.
chair at the time, and I
You
stepped
you
out of that.
twisted my
How has
arm.
and that's what
Oh.
you're actually not the first one to use that phrase on me, that I twist people's arms to to get them to do what I want them to do. But how has being active here in Texas and Dallas compared to being active elsewhere as you lived?
Well, I think we have a really good crew of people in Dallas, some really good Democrats. Um, in general, being in Texas because of Governor Abbott, Mr. Paxton, Mr. Patrick, my least favorite of the 3, um, probably because he's
More than
uh,
Paxton?
well, it's close. Well, Paxton probably is a good attorney, I just don't like his policies, but Patrick seems like
Oh,
kind of a dummy. And Abbott's very smart, so, never underestimate the trio of them.
yeah,
But,
absolutely.
I think, uh, it's afforded me, an opportunity to spend more time on local stuff than national stuff, and as some famous person who I can't remember said, "All politics is local."
Hmm.
Probably Moynihan or somebody like that, or maybe, Speaker Tip O'Neill, probably was him. But,
Hmm.
from that perspective, so it's interesting, it's fun. I think because, of the chokehold that the Republicans have on Texas, uh, you know, anything we can do to improve that, you feel like you got a big win.
Yeah, yeah. What would you say the biggest positive of Texas is from a political perspective, and the biggest negative?
People. I think the people in Texas are really great. very dedicated. A lot of the people I've worked with are just top notch. So that's really good. Um, the challenges are big, but the people who are tackling them are also, up for it. So I think that's excellent.
Where do you see Texas or Dallas? I'll let you choose. Politically in 10 years.
Oh boy. Where's my crystal ball, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think Dallas, I haven't been around the rest of Texas that much to know, but a lot of the big cities trend more democratic than the rural parts do. Um, I think we'll see progress. You know, I think there's a lot of good people in Dallas, and I think as a result of what's going on politically now, either people are going to get extremely frustrated with Congress for not doing their job, and not, doing the oversight that's necessary of the president. Um, that it could, there could be some really dramatic changes, kind of parallel to the Watergate thing, in the 70s where, um, you're just not allowed to do that kind of stuff. You can't bug your opponent's headquarters. You can't send shifty ex-CIA people around to do bad stuff. It's just not really a good plan. And, there's a lot of shifty stuff going on right now. And I think while a lot of people, if they believe, which I think a lot of people do, that Trump's helping them, it, it takes a while for them to understand that he's not really helping them. He's only helping himself, to a pile of money. So, a long, long time ago in polling, one of the big gurus taught us that in general, for the public to figure out what's actually going on, there's about a 6-month time lag. Something might happen last January, but no one's going to
Yeah.
figure it out till the summer or fall,
Yeah.
because it just takes a long time in the everyday scheme of things for people to go, well, wait a minute. They have to kind of think about it. It has to hit them, affect them. And I think that's what's gonna ultimately happen here, and I'm hoping things will, if there's such thing as normal, politically, where the courts have their role, the executive branch has its role, and Congress has its role, and we get back to that, and we are not so, um, extremely polarized politically that we can't get anything accomplished. I mean, I can't think of anything, for anybody in the state of Texas who wants a really good experience if you're a Democrat, go to the University of Texas and go to the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library, because on a wall there are all the bills, all the legislation that he either sponsored or did as the Senate Majority Leader or did in the White House. And he wasn't in the White House that long, I don't know, maybe 5 years, because he didn't run, in 68. Historically, when you see that and you compare it to what's going on in the last, I don't know, 20 years of the government, maybe 15 years. It's like, wait a minute, how did Congress, the White House get so much accomplished and now we can't seem to do anything? So I think, I've always been the glass is half full, not empty kind of person. Maybe a little too Pollyanna ish, if there's such a word, of being a positive person. And so I think just given the right amount of time, hopefully we'll swing back to being more centrist, if there's a word, but more, the triangle of politics, nationally, or in each state. Everybody has the same sort of level. There's the courts, there's the legislative, there's the executive, whether it's a governor, the Senate, the House, whatever. It's all pretty much the same. And hopefully we'll get back to where, um, people are doing their oversight. They're doing things that are really good for the people, and, protect the environment and do good things. The biggest thing
Absolutely.
that just kills me in all of this is the people who are really getting damaged here are children.
Yeah.
The SNAP program, the maternal benefits, all these poverty programs, Medicaid, stuff like that. We are endangering generations of kids who won't get the kind of education they need, the support they need, and it's not a lot of money, when you really think about it in terms of individually what these people get, maybe 150 bucks a month for food. I mean, there was a time when senators and stuff were going out and sleeping outside to see what it was like to be a homeless person. I don't see them doing that
Right.
anymore. But, to me, that's the saddest part of what we're doing now. We know from, you know, studies and everything that's gone on since these programs were created in the 60s that if you don't give kids what they need in the first few years of their lives, not a good scenario for them having healthy lives the rest of their lives. And to think that we're doing that now to the most vulnerable people in the country, and then you add on veterans, then you add on elderly disabled people, and that's where I get less optimistic and a little more pessimistic when I see stuff like that. So it's kind of sad.
And it's a vicious cycle too, and I think Republicans know that. Target the least among us, and then as you said, the kids, and then the kids grow up not having what they need, and so target them and their
Yeah,
kids, and they know that, and they know how to play the game. And it's
it
depressing.
is.
Now, recently there has been a little bit of good news, at least on the state level here in Texas. The federal court struck down two things. The 10 commandments being posted in schools. And if you're outside of Texas, yes, that was actually a thing.
Yes.
Schools were posting the 10 commandments on their
And not
walls
just
as
like a
if
poster, but
this.
like big gaudy things with like stone, like from the era of the
You,
old movies from the 1950s.
well, I was about to say, what's the name of the guy from My Cold Dead Hands that played
Yeah,
Moses?
Charlton Heston.
Charlton Heston, yeah, that guy.
Yeah, exactly.
That actually happened here. And gerrymandering also got struck down. So Trump's whole big idea about getting five or more, whatever, Republicans out of Texas, that didn't work in his favor.
Mhm.
So that's definitely some good news. But yes, we got a long way to go, as you said,
Well, and
Michelle.
the thing is
Uh,
that based on the process they used versus what California did, California sent it to a vote for the people. The people got to vote. It's a much different process. So I think it's unlikely for the Ninth Circuit in California to rule in the same way that the El Paso judges ruled on this particular case because the methods were very different. So, and it's happening all
uh-huh,
over the US pretty much because everybody,
uh-huh.
Trump's out there saying, well, let's get more Republicans, do this with your, congressional boundaries. And we got to admit, some of them were pretty crazy. And I think what'll be interesting is all the people like Julie Johnson or Jasmine Crockett or the Austin guys, poor Lloyd Doggett, who said, well, I guess I won't run anymore. Now they're all going to have to figure that out and figure out, okay, who is going to run because their districts aren't going to change. So that's probably a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Is there anything that you wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to share in this episode?
Sure. For anybody who's looking for a new pet, no, I'm a big advocate for animals, and everybody probably who knows me knows I do volunteer work at Operation Kindness, which is here in North Texas, and they do a lot of work with Dallas Animal Services, with a lot of the regional animal shelters, and bringing in dogs and cats. And so if anybody is looking for a pet this Christmas, highly recommend both going to Dallas Animal Shelter or Garland or Richardson, Operation Kindness, any of these groups, because the animals, are vetted, they get medical care, they get spayed, neutered. And that's a really good thing. And animals can be really lifelong pets. They're good for your health, all kinds of good things. And there's a viral video that I think 180 million people have seen where this little boy who's been asking for a dog for like 6 years, his dad finally brings a box. And I think it must have been for his birthday. And when he opens it up, there's a little brown doodle dog in the box. And the kid just starts crying. And his brother, comes over and puts arms around him. But pets can make a big difference. So check out your
They
local
sure do.
shelter.
They sure do. Absolutely. All right, Michelle. Well, thank you for hopping on Folks, this has been Chronicles of a Dallas County Democrat. We out.